But here we are, united by machines, and hopefully enjoy
Exactly.
and the pleasure of what's about to occur. I'm Paul Pangaro. For those of you who don't know me, I'm president of the American Society for Cybernetics. Thank you for joining us. This is another event in the series Cybernetics and Humans Knowing, which is a continuing cadence of events that highlight ideas and participants in the global cybernetics community. I'd like to introduce Tom Scholte, who's a trustee of the ASC, also a VP, and designer of this session. Tom.
Thank you very much. And we'll also be hearing from my cat, it seems, and I'll do my best to be on the mute button because he's, here he goes. He's going to get noisy. So this is, thank you, first of all, to the organizers and to Alcibiades for allowing me the opportunity to do this event. I'm coming to you from Vancouver on the traditional unceded and ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And this is a unique event because, as some of you may know, I co-host a podcast channel called the New Books in Systems and Cybernetics, which is on the fabulous New Books Network, which I urge you to check out if you've never seen it. There's a channel for virtually every discipline you can imagine, and then some that you haven't. And we're lucky to have this channel on there. We are recording this meeting to both be an ASC speakers event and to be an episode of the New Books in Systems and Cybernetics. So that also then dictates a little bit about the format we're going to use, and that conversation and questions are definitely going to be separated. Usually there is no audience for a New Books interview. It's an hour long and then it's done, but we're going to have up to an hour, and we can stop earlier if we run out of things to talk about. I don't think we will, but and then we're going to have questions afterwards. So I'm going to be mostly ignoring the chat. I'll be upfront about that during the interview, but then we will have a good lengthy bit of time to try and get to either questions in the chat or people want to jump in, and we'll have, I'm sure, a lively conversation. So yeah, I think that's all I need to say about that. Oh, thank you. Someone's putting good stuff in the chat here in terms of how to find the podcast, and you'll recognize other members of the ASC having been guests and other people through the community. Alcibiades and I just met for the first time a couple days ago. Most of the guests, or a lot of the guests I have are folks I don't know. I just get interested in their books and track them down, and then they agree to be on here. So Alcibiades and I had a bit of a chance to chat, but he's probably not known to a lot of folks here unless you've had the pleasure of reading his book. But obviously, being involved here in an ongoing organization devoted to cybernetics. The title, The Collapse of Cybernetics, got my attention. And as you'll see, the book is really about a philosophical investigation, oh my goodness, of what Alcibiades is calling classical cybernetics, and what usually here in the ASC we refer to as first order cybernetics. There's a lot of interesting things for us to discuss about continuities between those or lack thereof, which maybe we'll get to in question period. But we're going to start way back in the origins of cybernetics, and also explore it through the lens of particular questions that Alcibiades has had that he will obviously explain much better than I. So first, welcome Alcibiades Malapi-Nelson to both the ASC Speaker Series and New Books in Systems and Cybernetics. So we will begin with the traditional question on the New Books Network, which is, can you tell us a little bit about your intellectual background, your biography, and how you came to an engagement with cybernetics?
Yeah, loaded question. Sure. So, as you know, some of you already, I'm a Latin American. So I pursued philosophy there, bachelor's, honors. And as you may or may not know, it's continental through and through. As I was telling Tom, not even Hume was taught to me. So that's stuff that I learned in North America. It's European and medieval and the classics, basically. Then I moved to Canada, to French Canada, and even being French Canada, I studied in English, Concordia. I did my master's. There I got acquainted with the analytic tradition, which I I just had to learn it, let's put it that way. So there was some philosophers that were attracting my attention. One of them, actually Jerry Fodor, who was quite critical, who died a little while ago, of the tradition. And that's one of the first moments where I began to hear about these explanatory mechanisms, about reason being possibly mechanical, about the Turing machine, the Turing tests, and all these notions. And it got me interested. I continued my let's say, investigation, particularly philosophy of mind, for a while anyways. Cognitive science within that. My master's degree was in philosophy of cognitive science, always with a continental kind of a bent, a little bit of a Heideggerian critique there. And then I began to do my my PhD, first in Ottawa U, taking a course at Carleton, also in cognitive science. But I ended up at York University, first under Evan Thompson, but then I began to steer away from cognitive science, back into philosophy per se. And within philosophy, when I came back, I kind of reconnected a previous interest of mine, which was physics. I was very interested in physics when I was a younger guy, anyways. And so I ended up in philosophy of science. And within there, the nagging question always about mechanisms, about even representation that had to do with mechanistic representations as well. And so I began to wonder, what is it that these people meant by mechanisms, by explanatory mechanisms even? And to my surprise, as I was advancing to Tom the other day, I didn't find any philosophical articulation of what a machine is, okay? A mechanism, vaguely, a little bit here and there, but a machine, certainly nothing. And yet these guys are using this metaphorical language. Are they actually meaning it literally? When I was asking questions in talks to cognitive scientists, they were kind of like, I don't know, not answering. They were just saying, what do you mean by that? When I say, I actually mean if you mean that there is a kind of machine going on inside, machinery. All these untapped areas made me try to understand better what is it that we're talking about here. My supervisor, Jagdi Hatiagari, who is a philosopher of science, he is the guy who realized that, oh, because I was reading, guys, for years, I'm saying a couple of years at U of T, the library, all day, about mechanisms of machines from wherever I can get. It is this supervisor who told me, you should read this article. You should read about cybernetics, right? And I began to read about cybernetics, and I clicked instantly. I realized that these guys were dealing with whatever that I didn't know at the time, really, what is it that I was looking for. These guys were into that. So I began to get into cybernetics in an interesting, serious manner. And my supervisor also, I mean, I guess he realized my interest, and he proposed to, why don't you write a dissertation on this, okay? Because until now, like, we don't know what happened. So yeah, so he is one of those, as most people, I would say, guys, they would say that cybernetics not here anymore. I mean, classical cybernetics. Now we want to be more clear, right? So what happened? What happened? Because what these guys said was fascinating, and it took over the world for a decade at least. Every person reasonably intelligent had to have that book there in his shelf, right? To show Cybernetics 1948 by Wiener. It went it reached Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, Europeans, America. You don't have to even be a philosopher, an engineer, a scientist. Any reasonably intelligent person would read at least the introduction of that book. What happened 10 years later? 1953, for intents and purposes, the thing is not there anymore, and the rest is history. Now, obviously, as I was talking with Tom, things that now we take for granted in science have a clear cybernetic signature. It's just that there is a problem there that, by the way, needs to be studied. There's no serious study of the disconnection, the wedge between contemporary science, say neuroscience, nanotechnology, and what I talk about in my book in the last part, and cybernetics. Nobody has made I mean, we have mentioned the link because the links are evident, but there's no serious study scholarship on the relationship between cybernetics and contemporary science, let's put it like that. Probably one that the person that mentioned it the most is Jean-Pierre Dupuy in his Mechanization of the Mind. There is a second chapter in that book that does talk about the, he calls it the poor beloved parents. Basically, the contemporary science doesn't acknowledge the ancestry of cybernetics. So that was basically my journey. That's how I got into cybernetics. So I finished my dissertation. I was approached by a scholar and proposed me to make it into a book if I connected with what I, from the beginning, thought was connected, which is contemporary science, particularly the disruptive technologies that we're getting into now, the so-called convergent technologies, nanotechnology, information technology, cognitive science, biotechnology, and all that. So that part was not in my dissertation, but I was able, thanks to the book, I was able to put it back to connect with cybernetics. And that was basically the context. That's how it happened. Right? So now I'm looking forward. Of course, cybernetics will always be my interest. It was almost a romantic thing, really. It is a fascinating story. I was telling Tom, very sad at a point by the fact that I couldn't meet these guys. They didn't die too long ago. But now I'm doing more the ethical implications of technologies that have a cybernetic signature, right? A clear one. Because I do believe, as I put in the book, that there was a metaphysical program behind cybernetics, for sure, that is now alive and well in these programs, and that now the contemporary programs, they might have an opportunity to flourish and to basically sidestep the fate that happened to that put cybernetics down eventually. So now we are more optimistic, let's put it like that. Okay, so we have to learn from what happened in cybernetics so that these things don't happen again.
Great, thank you. And I'm you were mentioning defining this era where cybernetics was a word that was on the lips of so many, as you're saying, anyone who had aspirations to being thought of as a really contemporary hip thinker had at least a copy of Wiener's book on their shelf. They might not have read it all or understood any of the diagrams, but they had at least read the introduction. Yeah. Cybernetics is on the cover of Time magazine, and it was and a number of people have posited that it was the sort of over-promise, whether by the cyberneticians themselves or those who promoted it, that it was going to be this magical science of everything that was going to take care of everything and then for the stark contrast of it being losing funding, et cetera, as time went on. But one of the things that's key for me about your book that is different from, say, Heim's book, The Cybernetics Group, and others have tried to explain the sort of rapid ascent and then the decline of the influence of cybernetics through historical types of interpersonal explanations, the famous split between Wiener and McCulloch and all of that, but that your approach is actually a philosophical one, that you're looking at the consequences of some fundamental commitments of first order cybernetics that we'll get to, and what you call this machine ontology that they commit to, and that there's a couple of fundamental tenets of classical cybernetics that end up in conflict with each other. But before we jump to that, can you say a little bit about the two sort of what are thought of as the two sort of major origin points? Obviously, we hear a lot about the Macy conferences. We hear less, at least in North America, until Andy Pickering's book, which talks a lot about it, but we hear less about the Ratio Club, usually over in the UK. So can you just say just a little bit about what those two different groups brought to the origins of cybernetics, and what were some of their overlaps, but some of their key differences as well.
Sure. The Macy conference, which is, as you say, what everybody knows, were more formal gatherings in New York, the first 9 of them, and New Jersey, the last one, so that von Neumann can attend, and he didn't attend, of course, at the last one, because Cybernetics was coming down, and he kind of saw the writing on the wall. The last 2 conferences, the 2, Wiener and von Neumann were not there anymore. But in any case, these guys were meeting in a formal setting, but everything was allowed. I mean, if you read the proceedings, Himes has to be thanked for this. These guys were fighting, and they were at a level of not political correctness that I've never seen. I asked my supervisor if people used to be like that, and not anymore, because now you don't see people talking like that to each other. What happened, right? Yeah, what happened? Was it that it was closed doors, but it wasn't that much closed door, because there were proceedings later. So these things that we know now, what they were screaming at each other. But these acted like, let's say, empirical study groups. So where they would propose their ideas, give themselves half a year, go test them, and come back with the results and expose them. And then they will be grilled by the audience. First twice a year, then once a year, for a space of a decade, more or less. There was funding, the Rockefeller Foundation, which is alive and well until now, still funding biomedical sciences, was behind. So these guys had this kind of semi-formal setting. It was at the hub of cybernetics. Besides the article of McCulloch and Pitts, the 1943 article, and the article by Wiener, Bigelow, and the other guy, Rosenbluth, plus the book. I would say these 2 things, plus the Macy conference, they were the theoretical hubs for cybernetics to thrive. But on the other side of the Atlantic, we had the Ratio Club, way more informal. The differences you are asking, informality. So it was beer in a basement of a hospital, no kind of fear against authority or of authority. So if somebody would become somebody's boss, you will have to resign from the group. No way of having proceedings, let alone eventually having a journal out of that was flatly rejected. So it was way more informal. There you say, perhaps more fun, okay? And they used to meet once a month. Imagine that. So these guys really became friends. And we're talking Walter Gray going there. Turing was a regular, right? So it was a huge contribution, especially when you see what happens after with cybernetics. Ashby, of course, was a regular there, right? And Pickering is correct in that it has not received enough attention. In my book, I put what was known at the time. I gathered it all and I put it there. I believe that now there's a book. I don't know if it's out already, but at the time there was a book being written about the Ratio Club alone. So as I put in my book, there is a little bit of a rivalry coming from British people. There's somebody here regarding what is the, who exerted more influence in cybernetics, perhaps related to the rivalry of who was behind the first computer at the end of the day,
right?
Which is kind of an interrogation mark until now, right? It's
yeah. So I want to jump
topic
in and specifically talk about a member of the Ratio Club who, gets mentioned in passing in the cybernetics, at least gatherings and things that I read these days, but is much more central to your book, particularly because your book is really focused on, as you say, you came from a philosophical question of, is there a philosophical definition of a machine? Because the idea of cybernetics, Ross Ashby's statement, the science of all possible machines and other machine interests of the early days, is Alan Turing. So can you say a little bit about why Turing gets the level of attention he gets in your book, and why he's maybe a more important figure in the history of cybernetics that you are tracing, which is a philosophical history, than maybe we see elsewhere? Why is Turing so central to what you're exploring in your book?
For a couple of reasons. First, because he came very close to define a machine. He didn't quite get there like Ashby, but when he talks about a perfectly mechanical procedure, something only doable by something like a machine in computable numbers, which is 1939, I believe, he gets very, 1936, he gets very close of defining it. And people noticed. Also because the Turing machine becomes the basis for McCulloch and Pick's article, and they acknowledge that, right? And later, also because Turing had a very close acquaintance with von Neumann for building the machine, for building the computer. So that kind of confuses the question, which one was first, right? Because von Neumann writes the first draft, and arguably perhaps Turing, uses another procedure to build it, but we don't know much about what was the situation and who was going first. But that influenced Turing in his change of mind regarding artificial intelligence, and that comes from cybernetics, right? Because there's this question, why he is not even conceiving the possibility of artificial intelligence in 1935, 36, and then 10 years later, he's saying the opposite, artificial intelligence as a given, right? And what I put forward in the book, if you see the history, if you trace the chronological happenings, it might have been the acquaintance that he had with the cyberneticians to begin to change his mind in terms of the possibility of artificial intelligence. So cybernetics had a huge influence in him, I would say, okay? Not only him in cybernetics, that is, I don't know if it's acknowledged or not. I don't think that he's as acknowledged as Wiener and the other guys, because he has other achievements as well that make him very famous, right? But yeah, so I believe that is these two reasons are the reasons why he has a situation of preeminence in the cybernetic group. He wasn't officially part of the cybernetic group, but the cybernetic milieu. Because now that Haynes says the cybernetic group, we're kind of enclosed in that, right? Yeah. Which was the guys from the American guys.
Yeah. And as a ratio club member, he obviously is in those conversations. So you do a lovely job in the book of tracing this journey of Turing's from saying artificial intelligence is not possible to moving towards it's a given. So this machine ontology, this idea, well, of course, when we look at the subtitle of Wiener's book, Communication Control in the Animal and the Machine, this notion of some kind of continuity where they can be classed in some way in the same category of machines and living things. So hence your interest in the question, well, then what is a machine? If we're building a sort of science or a way of thinking around this idea that there is some way they can be classified together, what is the definition of that? So I'm going to ask you sort of a two-part question, just because there's so much in this book to try and get through in the time we have. Can you say a little bit about the nature of a machine? And this is what you're going to point to later, ends up creating kind of conundrums within the cybernetics movement that are going to trip it up a few years down the road. And then maybe take that into your chapter on what are fundamental cybernetic tenets about the machine. And there's a few specific ones that you mentioned. A machine is immaterial. A machine, there's a few of those. So can you take us through some of that?
Yeah. So the question specifically is how this definition of the machine affected cybernetics?
Yeah, the definition of the machine itself, and then how that shows up inside the cybernetic tenets that you list, and that will eventually lead to some conflict with each other.
Okay, so the guy here is Ross Ashby. He's the guy, okay? Although the ideas might have been incipient in other guys like Kenneth Craig, one guy who was very interesting, but he died young. He had a synthetic method, basically a neo-Viconian, like as Giambattista Vico, understanding of how to show the epistemic model successful. Namely,
we might as well underline that now, which is the idea that if it's true, you can build it, right?
Yeah, which is Vico, Giambattista Vico, right?
Yeah.
So, and Kenneth Craig had this kind of idea as well. He was a guy who had formation of philosophy, then psychology, and he liked machines and engineering. But he died very young, and still he exercised a lot of influence in the Ratio Club, so that at a certain point they were thinking of having that his name, the Cray Club, instead of Ratio Club. So that influential he was, right? So although we can acknowledge him, and perhaps proto-ideas in Turing, even going back to Heinrich Hertz, the physicist of modernity, of the modern times, who also kind of came close to try to define the nature of a machine. It is Ross Ashby, the guy who was aware of all this. And he needed to extend the notion of machinery in order to make it compatible with life, basically with entities that can reorganize themselves. He saw that the traditional notion of a machine would be incompatible with this, so he needed to extend it, to dive into a notion of a machine and see if there is something richer that comes out of that. And he found that, yeah, that is the case. Basically, a machine as being that whose internal and external set of states uniquely determine their future set of states in a future point in time. With that, you don't need materiality, you don't even need physicality. Okay, so extension of the model of machinery grows, and he uses that cleverly. Eventually, obviously, he wants to put that in the flesh. So once that you have defined the notion, for the first time in history, mind you, it never happened before. You can verify, take your time. He was the first ever who defined a machine. That's something that sobers you up. Once the notion is there, once you realize that materiality is not necessary in order to have machinery, now for us it's obvious, right? Like a Java engine, software, whatever. Back in the day, when computers didn't exist, that was the insight, right? But again, don't forget the second part of second or third pillar of cybernetics. You have to build stuff, you have to put it in the flesh. There was a mandate, as Pickering correctly points out, of constructing this gallery of monsters in order to show that you understand, right? So cyberneticians had that always clear. It isn't the construction, it's in the implementation of this notion of machinery that problems began to happen. So, and we can go deeper into that if you like. We can talk about the homeostat. We can talk about,
So have we covered the major tenets? So there's it's immaterial, right? Are there any of the major tenets that you boiled it down to that we?
Oh yeah, one is machines are teleological.
The teleological, yeah.
Yeah, which you could say that Wiener perhaps was the first one in, seeing that. Machines are not necessarily material, right? And the model theories are immaterial machinery, that there are types of machinery, models or theories. Yeah.
Right.
So if a model is mechanical, it comes from a machine. Right. So there's something like a mechanical procedure or mechanical behavior that happens out of that of an entity. We can say that that entity is a machine.
Right. And this Ashby quote that you pulled out, which I certainly hadn't noticed before in the same way in my reading, this statement that and tell me if I paraphrase this incorrectly, but that the state of the machine and the state of the environment determine what it will do next.
Yeah, this is internal states and the external state of the entity. Those determine what happens in a near future or in the future. He doesn't say near future, in a unique manner.
Right.
That entity, which is interesting, is both internal and external, right? It's not just internal. So yeah, that's the definition of machine for him.
Okay.
I wish I could find the quote here, but anyway, that might be a little bit difficult.
So so another figure who you talk about that also is not talked about as much in cybernetic discourse these days is John von Neumann. And there's, a lot of baggage around von Neumann in terms of his war efforts, and there is certainly a strong narrative within cybernetics, at least as I've encountered it, that I've observed of the good Wiener and the bad von Neumann. And even Himes has another book about Wiener and von Neumann that kind of plays them as these foils to each other, the pacifist used and the collaborator. And I think there is truth to that, or maybe I don't want to use the word truth, but there is
True, yeah.
there's something to that, and maybe like all stories, it also is incomplete. So first of all, this idea that you say goes all the way back to Giambattista Vico and even is in Immanuel Kant, this idea of that if something is, and when I use the word true, I'm speaking in quotes as I'm quoting these people like Vico and Kant, you should be able to build it, right? You should be able to model it in the machine, in the metal, as they say, and that Dupuy talks a lot about in his fantastic book, which, as you mentioned, talks about how cognitive science does not adequately reflect upon its cybernetic parentage, so to speak. And that this notion of immateriality, but this desire, what does true in quotes means? I means I'm quoting someone else saying the word true. That's what I mean by true in quotes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but what do they mean by truth?
They meant that it actually pertains to, it is an accurate description of physical reality.
Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, that if your mechanical explanation of the way a phenomenon works or takes place is accurate, you should be able to build a model of it. Again, which is not a position I'm either defending or accepting, just in the historical context as I understand it and as I understand it in this book. And that's going to run into an inbuilt issue. That desire, that sense of immateriality and the desire to make physical models is going to run into some problems. So just in terms of the narrative, of course, McCulloch and Pitts, and jump in and help me clarify this if I leave out things or misrepresent them. But McCulloch and Pitts create their neural network in their famous paper, in which anything that can be said in language can be instantiated through these logical network of on and off gates, basically. And then von Neumann, of course, takes that, and this becomes a really, really great way to start designing an architecture for computers, but at the same time becomes very critical of McCulloch and Pitts and saying this actually is not an adequate model of how the human brain actually works. And the thing that I did not know about was this letter of concern that he sent to Wiener 2 years before he sort of went more public with his critique. Can you say a little bit about the letter that he wrote to Wiener and what was in it? And
it's a letter that was written quite early, actually. So he was thinking about it likely when he was delivering the first ever Macy conference. So I would contend that while von Neumann saw the writing on the wall, Ashby didn't, in terms of the crisis that was coming. So von Neumann, yeah, as you said correctly, gets the 1943 cryptic based upon Carnap nomenclator paper, and he writes the first draft on a train trip in one stroke. Works for not for computers. I mean, arguably for the first computer, because the first computer has to store the instructions can also be stored, right? So yeah, excellent, good job. But you guys, talking about McCulloch and Pitts, you intended this model to understand the mind. For that, it cannot possibly work. There is this famous exchange with McCulloch, where McCulloch kind of criticizes the machine, saying, "Oh, our neurons are way more efficient," which is an eco-modernist argument I'm hearing now, criticizing artificial intelligence and how it's going to be devastating on the environment, as opposed to our minds that are way more efficient. Saying that if we use von Neumann's machine, we will need the whole Niagara Falls for the current, and the Niagara River in order to take away the heat. But von Neumann, he goes the extra mile after. He doesn't say no, he says, yeah, but with your model, we will need the entire physical universe to instantiate it. So he said the physical universe you wouldn't have enough space to instantiate your model if you wanna model a mind. Model for a mind would not be feasible. We couldn't have, like, if we just count the parts that your model would make us do, basically counting the parts of what a mind consists of, we wouldn't have an entire lifetime, wouldn't be enough, right? So at the end of the day, we have computers thanks to a failed model of the mind, right? That's what is going on here, right? So, and that's something to think about, right? How science works, right? How technology works, right? It all goes sideways, right? And yeah, so that gives him the warning signs regarding where cybernetics is going, right? Because modeling the mind with these models, guys, which is our pillars, they are our pillars, it's not going to happen. So he enters in a kind of epistemic shock, and he goes back to the basics, right? Because he was already studying biology, biomedical sciences for 10 years, 10 years. He had a connection with the biomedical community. As a matter of fact, Warren McCulloch, he says that biologists might have taken notice of his article because of von Neumann mentioning his article to these guys, right? So, and you know what came what came after, sorry. Let's go back to the basics, right? Let's find one thing that we might consider alive, viruses, and let's try to at least model that. Mind you, it's still the cybernetic mentality of behavior, right? I think it's such because of the way it behaves.
Yeah. So I just want to pause here for a second because we haven't really underlined that the way you emphasize it in your book, is that one of the hopes of cybernetics, that it's going to differentiate it from other sciences, is that it's not going to try and pry open every little black box. It's going to be able to model behavior without necessarily having to recreate the fine structure of everything.
It's all about behavior, yes.
And now von Neumann is challenging that by saying, well, if you look at the implications of the McCulloch-Pitts model, we have to go back to something much simpler, and we have to actually pry it open and go back to prying open black boxes, which according which in your account, they're saying, well, that's actually not what we wanted cybernetics to do. That's actually the work of other sciences. We wanted cybernetics to do this other thing. And now you're telling us we have to go back to smaller entities and pry them open and get into all the details of structure that we were trying to not wrestle with initially. Have I got that correct in terms of your account?
Yes, you did. And the point I was mentioning was that he saw that perhaps from the very beginning, as opposed to Ashby, right? Ashby, when you see his diary entries about dams, is painful. You know, you are sad. You know, you're like, poor guy, really. You know, so he doesn't have a choice, you know, but to think out the structure of the thing, to begin to think in those very uncybernetic terms, right? No longer behavior, because behavior is going nowhere. He observed dams for 2 years, which was the Homeostat 2.0, right? The more complicated Homeostat, right? Who couldn't find a pattern. So he began to wonder about, you know, how evolution might have some kind of design. You know, these gateways have to be put there by Mother Nature, perhaps, you know. So because behavior was leading nowhere. So he comes out as well, he jumps out of this cybernetic tenet of basically what you were saying. We can put an overarching epistemic platform based upon behavior. If machines, animals, including humans, and other things as well.
And we trace
in a
that
machine-like way, it's a machine. Sorry?
Yeah. And we trace that to Ashby's statement that cybernetics doesn't ask what things are, but what they do. Is that correct?
Exactly.
That idea is. So we should jump back and talk a little bit about the homeostat and sort of then bring it back to this point that we're talking about. So It's always a section I find very distressing to read at the Macy conferences because I want everyone to get along so well. The famous session where Ashby comes and brings the homeostat to the Macy conferences, and it actually doesn't go that well. And I think some of the same conundrums are present inside some of the critique that comes from Pitts and from others about the homeostat. So maybe say a bit about what the homeostat is for those who aren't as aware of that, and then the critique that it ran into when Ashby brought it across the Atlantic to the Macy conferences.
Yeah, on that note, as a context, as I was saying, as you are saying, in the Macy conferences, the conflict and the I wouldn't say violence, but they were like straight up attacks against each other, and yet Ashby puts in his diary, it was a nice day. Everything went amazing. So it makes you wonder.
Has not entirely disappeared from the cybernetics community. I'll just say that.
Okay, fair enough. I asked my supervisor, are British guys like more open? Like that? Are Americans more like, or North America more like, politically correct? What's going on here? People are fighting on one side and actually say it was a nice day. Everything went fine, right? So the homeostat was a very cybernetic machine, let's put it that way. You had Walter Gray's tortoises, and you had Claude Shannon's rats, right? Which were attracting attention, of course, media and all that. And of course, you have computers, which come out of cybernetics, at least von Neumann's, what people don't acknowledge. Sure, you can say that too. You have the prognosticator the predictor, of Wiener, arguably with which everything started with that machine, also a failure that opened up all these insights, right? What kind of man in the machinal structure? What kind of machine is man? What kind of mechanical part is man? We have to understand that so that we can interface them with weapons, basically, with weaponry, that would work better, right, against the German attacks. The homeostat on the other side, you have to really observe what's going on there. It wouldn't move, it wouldn't walk around. There were 4 cubes made of aluminum. This guy gathered World War II spare parts, Basically, to put it in a nutshell, on top of these 4 cubes, you had a needle that was floating on water, on a liquid, right? That could go from, it was like a gauge. It could go like this, 45 degrees to 45 degrees. And when it will be in the middle, it will be in equilibrium. Okay, it will be in the center. And the 4 needles on top of these cubes were interconnected, right? By, of course, electricity is going through, right? So what happened was that whenever you would change the wiring of the machine, these needles begin to go hunting for equilibrium, to go back to this middle point. How? It seems randomly, by trial and error, right? So you disconnect one and rewire the other 3, take away the other one and put it up, like, another kind of rewire. No matter what you would do, these needles would seem to go hunting for a while, and then they will settle right back in the middle, finding this equilibrium. It would seem to learn. It would seem to get into a trial and error hunting of basically survival. So for Ashby, this machine represents, and even when I say represent, I'm like a little bit cautious in what I'm saying, represents the animal and its environment, okay? Because for Ashby, his master being Walter Cannon, basically to exist, first, to be alive is to be in homeostasis, right? You are constantly coping with the environment in order to find a balance. That is to survive. Then he extends that to things in general. That's the controversial thing as well, right? He says that that's not only living things, it's everything. Reality is basically like that. So it's as opposed to Wiener, who talks about entropy as being almost an evil force. For him, there was no other chance for life but to come about, basically, because it's a way of being of the universe, finding balance, just to be. Right? So when we come back to a homeostat, we see in his view, and then eventually in everybody's view, an animal with his environment. He shows how is it that it works. Okay, and that clashes with perhaps the last remnants of metaphysical tenets that cyberneticians themselves had, because they had a hard time equating that with talking about cats, a cat finding its prey, a cat doing, or a mouse doing something in order to survive, with this machine finding equilibrium by means of trial and error. Ultimately, Ashby, very patient, he addresses all the questions. He doesn't lose his shit, nothing. He's like, calm all the time. But at the end, he says, look, if a thing reorganizes itself and then behaves differently, could you say that that thing learned? People said, yes. Well, the homeostat behaves differently. And that came as a shock to everybody.
Right.
People were like, oh, really? Yeah, you're right, And that's amazing because the audience changes its position.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps Bigelow a little bit upset because he was the guy nagging from the beginning, the engineer. And but the audience takes over, right? And doesn't even allow the guy to finish. They go on, say, yeah, this guy is right. That's how it is, exactly. So it is a moment where basically cyberneticians, and I think that Dupuy sees the same thing, cyberneticians are shown what they constructed. They are in shock, but they gradually accept, yes, this is what it takes. This is a price we all paid, okay? This is a life, right? Which nowadays perhaps is less of a shock. We will say, some people will say that, I don't know, artificial life is about to happen, computer viruses and all that, but back in the day, not so much, right?
And that leads, and then that leads to Ashby then also confronting, that if I have to extrapolate this model to a larger size to really account for all of the complexity that it's attempting to be an explanatory mechanism for, he then creates dams, which is another thing, and you can read a lot about it, both in Pickering's book, somewhat in yours, and also a more elaborate technical description of it, I think, in Pickering's book. And he is also swamped by this sense of despair that for 3 years, he tries to see it establish some kind of pattern of equilibrium, and he takes copious notes, and for 3 years, until it sort of defeats him. Yeah.
So Pickering believes that he said that he would accept a PhD student who would like to do a whole dissertation on dams, right? That much he finds it in terms of the philosophical consequences that this failure reveals, right? So yeah, you're absolutely right. He did receive with empathy the criticisms that there were just 4 uniselectors, and life is more complicated than that, even very simple life. He accepts this, and he says, okay, I'm going to make it more complicated. I think that the possible combinations were like 400,000 or less than that, and obviously life is more than that. We're talking behavior still, don't forget that, it can explode. And in terms of possibilities, variations. So he builds dams, right? For dams, he did have funding. Well, for the homeostat, he did it by himself in his garage with like spare parts, right? And 2 years observing dams, racking his brains, trying to first design better, tinker with the thing. Then in a certain moment, he doesn't tinker with anything. He said, maybe we'll attain self-stabilization by itself, nothing, right? And yeah, that's when he begins to wonder what von Neumann was saying in the first place. Maybe nature does come with certain things, right? For which you have to dive into structure. This is a structured conversation. This opening the black box, right? Which he doesn't do. So what I propose there, and I'm sure I'm not alone, is that Ashby, because of the being flabbergasted, as Neumann would say, by the complexity of trying to, now that we're opening a structure and you have the cybernetic dictum that you have to build, you're paralyzed. With behavior, you could do it. With behavior, you could build. But now you open and you see a structure, no longer. Because the model is the thing itself at a certain point. And it's just impossible to do it. What do? You step away and jump into the realm of the immaterial. And that's what you guys perhaps would call second-order cybernetics. I don't know. You correct me, because I don't know about that. That's not what I studied. But that's how I see it anyways. And I'm sure I'm not the only one, right? Because even von Neumann, we could say that at a certain point, he's jumping into a lattices, into a cellular automata, was the same move, right? He goes into a situation that was not dissimilar to Ashby, right? We can talk about that if you like, which is the kinetic model, right? When he wants to build these things in a three dimensions, he can't, like nowhere near, right? He ends up doing what now we perhaps see as like the game of life. This is, you spoke of Conway and Wolf and all these guys, right? So, which is not cybernetics, right? That's at least not classical cybernetics anyways. You know, you have to build stuff, man. You have to show it.
Great. So yeah, that's the conundrum in a sense that for you undoes classical cybernetics.
Correct.
That it's aspirations to be at the level of behavior rather than structure, but then its commitments to building models then leads it back to, whether or not such a thing is actually, can it be instantiated in the material realm? And then it leads to something else that on your account then betrays what the original commitments of cybernetics was. So he can go off into cellular automata, but that's not really cybernetics. Von Neumann says, we got to go back down to the level of viruses. We got to start with something much simpler. We have to model that.
And even that is impossible. Even that, right? The most simple virus is not feasible in his time anyway. So, right. Behavior works when the model object is not that complex. Once it's a little bit complex, it explodes in complexity. We will now say probably computational explosion. Nowadays, we would probably say something like that, right? Okay, so we cannot handle that. Then let's open and let's see what's going on inside. And once we see inside, wow, we find ourselves a surprise that combined with the dictum of building, which you could do based upon behavior, not based upon structure. Because we're talking about replicating the whole thing about the base model of a cat is another cat, preferably the same cat. It's like the Borges, you know, the Jorge Luis Borges map, right? When it gets that accurate, it's basically the same thing, right?
It's the same thing, yes. And I've got my best model here. And it's one of my favorite quotes. The ideal model of a cat is another cat, or preferably the same cat, which comes from Rosenbluth and Wiener. That by the time you've recreated the structure, you've made the real thing, the actual.
I wonder if Wiener was aware of the implications of that
quotation.
Sentence. Yeah. Like some years later, perhaps he was in denial, because after the letter, which is my speculation, right? In that chapter, post hoc ergo propter hoc, which is a fallacy, right? Because it happened. This distancing from Wiener, between Wiener and von Neumann, happened after the letter, right? And he doesn't talk about the letter ever. So one can speculate, perhaps, maybe it threw Wiener into deep denial, right? In any case, these guys stopped talking, right? They began to not like each other. They began to like passive-aggressive moves against each other, right? So yeah, one wonders if Wiener was aware of the consequence of that, right? Yeah.
And one thing that Wiener did say, and you reminded me of, and it's always something that also that I find painful because I don't want it to be the case, because for me, moving into what might be considered the immaterial, a lot of where cybernetics has gone, this isn't the entirety of second order cybernetics, of course, by any means, but cybernetics has gone to social phenomena, which of course is also that wildly complex. And Wiener never believed that cybernetics could
Not for a
deal with
minute.
social,
Not for a minute.
never
And as
believed.
far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, as far as I know, same thing with the British guys. The Rachel Clapp, nothing of that. Yeah.
We may have some actual former students of Ross Ashby's in this meeting who may be able to tell us whether Ashby said anything about social phenomena. So yes, just like with actors, we count our Kevin Bacon number, right? How many steps are you away from Kevin Bacon? In this group, we get to count our Ashby number and our Maturana number, etc. Yes, Bateson wanted to take things in that direction, and both Himes and other accounts make it clear actually how rough a time Bateson had it in those meetings. And Dupuy describes Bateson as being completely out of it, which is not a description I want to ascribe to, but it was not smooth sailing and Bateson and Mead were amongst the only social scientists there on a regular basis. And it was not easy sailing. Now, I, of course, personally have not surrendered my cybernetic approach to social phenomena, and I probably won't. But
Stafford Beer is your guy, right?
What's that?
Stafford Beer is your guy, right? Stafford
Beer and others, but Stafford Beer is one for me who bridges the first and the second order in some ways. But so yeah, anyway, but your book has served as a really, for me, a sort of bracing historical reminder and provocation while I'm not about to, and I imagine a number of people in this room are not about to completely surrender our beliefs or ideas, commitments rather, to social cybernetics having something to say about social phenomena and something of value. That it was not in the domain, certainly of Wiener and others in the early days, is something that is there, whether we want to try and move beyond it or whether we take it as something that we need to pay attention to in various ways. So thank you so much. We haven't unfortunately got to what do I mean when using social in this dialogue? Well, I'll ask Alcibiades, when you say social phenomenon that would not be tractable in the cybernetic way, can you tell me what your understanding? I have my own definition, but I'd like to hear from you first.
Huge numbers of people.
Huge numbers of people and the ways they behave.
Yeah. Societies. Yeah, I mean, Wiener is very clear about that. So one person, maybe. We are machines, of course. Yeah. Artificial intelligence is a known question because we are here, we are moving, we are intelligent. Artificial intelligence has to be true, has to be real, because we are the artificial intelligence, right? We are machines. But that's enough complexity, right? And he does write other stuff later, right? The human use of human beings and all that stuff, But it's about how cybernetics will change the world. It's not about applying cybernetics to society. So yeah.
Okay. And as you're saying, that's what you're looking at, the commitments of what you would call classical cybernetics. And obviously the field has moved into to limit the social and human groups is problematic today. Absolutely. Okay. So it's clearly time to move into questions. Unfortunately, we didn't get to talk about your discussion of the current nanotechnology, et cetera, but I leave that for readers to get into, and maybe it'll come up in our conversation about how you think that there are lessons if one has any commitments to the nano bio, what's the acronym again?
NBIC.
NBIC, nano bio info cogno convergence. There's much Alcibiades has to say about that, but I'm sure there's lots of questions as well. So thank you, Alcibiades, for your discussion. And let's open it up to questions. Who is the moderator and how do they want to handle questions? I'm hoping that's...
I was asked to do that, but we don't have any quite. You've been monitoring it, I see, so there's nothing new here.
Okay, well, but yeah. Dave Douglas asks, how important was the disagreement over using digital versus analog concepts and equipment? If the pro-analog folks had prevailed, could first-order cybernetics have survived the critics, hard AI, etc.?
There was some conversation about that in the Macy conferences about analog versus digital. I don't think there was a chance even. Why? If you ask me, because of McCulloch and Pitt's model, which is digital. So it comes out of that, what? A computer. So the analog approach was mostly pushed by psychologists, and even within them, people who are into psychoanalysis, right? Kluwer and these German guys, you know, fiercely intelligent people who were very distrustful and suspicious of mechanizing things, because mechanization is understood roughly as perhaps closer to something digital than to something analog, right? So yeah, I don't think that there was a, if you ask me, I mean, cybernetics wouldn't go that way, right? For example, the Gestalt guys, they were into Gestalt. These guys were into the analog situation, but they were completely dismissed by for example, McCulloch, right? McCulloch had a thing against, especially psychoanalysis, mental states that are not clear, because his model is exactly the opposite, and that was the value that von Neumann recognized. As long as a thing can be precisely described, that thing can be computed, right? So, and computation ultimately is not analog, unless you can say that there is, which I guess there is a possibility that you can say in the broader sense of computation, right?
Probably
Yes.
one of the reasons that cybernetics, as it does live on, and all of us here attest to the fact that it does live in new and fascinating ways, ended up in family therapy, in places where gestalts are taken seriously. I know you're smiling because Dupuy, in his book, The Mechanization of the Mind, which also, if you want another book that will push some of your buttons as much as Alcibiades' book might, read Dupuy's The Mechanization of the Mind, which is about how cognitive science grows out of cybernetics. But Dupuy is absolutely unapologetic and says that he finds it a tragedy that cybernetics ended up in family therapy and not in the places it began. Whereas I find that actually something to celebrate. Larry has a question.
Yeah, well, thank you. Just a comment first. It's interesting that in the Macy conferences, that it was Bateson and Mead and von Forster, maybe a couple of others, that attended all of them, where everyone else did not.
Yes. Yeah.
My question, I'd like to try to make a link between what you're calling classical cybernetics and what many of us have taken up in more recent years. And maybe a start with your observation of von Neumann's criticism of McCulloch and Pitt's neural nets, because those have been addressed by some of the other people. I mean, Aspie himself invoked Bremerman's limit when he was talking about, you know, that kind of issue, and just suggested let's focus on constraints rather than on cause and effect, and let's you know, constraints on behavior in particular. But Bateson, in this criteria of mind, von Forster's non-trivial machine, and its focus on, or its invoking of history as an important component in trying to understand behavior. And then even Maturana in his attempts at explaining living system by making the distinction between structure and organization as arising in two entirely different domains, non-intersecting domains, as he would say, leading to this idea of autopoiesis. So the question is, I don't know how much of this you've looked at or how you thought about making connections with some of these things, that all of which, as I look at them, have to do with non-physicality. These are attempts to deal with phenomena we experience, but not as physical phenomena.
Larry, for a while, I was, as I said, I came to York University by the invitation of Evan Thompson, who was into, you know, Maturana Varela and the Chilean school and all that, autopoiesis. How can I put it? I just yeah, I just didn't find it that interesting, to be honest. I mean, for me, cybernetics answer personally a lot of questions that philosophers are asking about the nature of explanation itself. So, I mean, there was something deeper about cybernetics and its failure, classical cybernetics, of course, that is still to be recognized as a lesson to receive from that, right? To be honest, the uniqueness and even the romance of classical cybernetics is something that I didn't see in whatever happened later, having to do with the circle of people that you're talking about. Even some kind of Heideggerian cognitive science, some kind of situated approach to cognition. There is a book by Margaret Boden about the history of cognitive science, a 2-volume book. She has a kind of a critical, basically evaluation of whatever happened outside this realm that made it a try with Evan Thompson and these guys. We don't like. I don't think that cognitive science has much of an interest even now, right? Combining Buddha, some mystical studies, and in cognitive science. I have nothing against, let's put it that way, but I was fascinated by classical cybernetics. I mean, the machine building situation and how that, I mean, what entailed in terms of the problems, epistemically speaking, because of not being aware of your own metaphysics, can perhaps give a lesson to today's technology, nanotechnology, mostly perhaps nanotechnology. And so, yeah, so that is basically what I have to say, right? Nothing against, but nothing for. Look, I can tell you this much. The idea of an observer affecting the observed is something that we have in Immanuel Kant. So for a philosopher, we're like, yeah, of course, right? Von Forster, a physicist coming from the post-quantic or very alive quanta environment and investigation, I'm assuming that he had in his mind, right? The photon of light behaves as a particle when you measure as a particle, as a wave when you measure as a wave. He comes from this tradition, I'm assuming, of Heisenberg and Planck and Bohr and all these guys, which we know of in philosophy of science. Is there. I mean, it's quantum mechanics is a topic, right? But for me, it didn't carry much of an interest as to something that I would devote myself to to study. For me, it was the building in the metal that attracted my attention, and what the consequence of that, right, for philosophy. Yeah.
Thanks. And Larry, you've given me a lot to think about in terms of developments in response to some of what Alcibiades is describing as sort of a crisis in cybernetics and the connections to what has come in subsequent developments in cybernetics, which is wonderful. A comment from Jamie Rose: if the key of cybernetics is linkages and communication connections, I would suggest that machines are insufficiently internally connected. That is, they are internally numb to the information data that it allows to flow through it. So that's an interesting comment if you want to say anything about that. And also I want to also get to Paul's question here now too, which is to clarify, he's asking, didn't von Neumann's direction for his machine architecture come directly from Turing's definition of universal machine? It sounded like Alcibiades is saying that it was a path clearly directed by rejecting neural nets. And this is something you do talk about in the book. So can you?
Yes, yeah. Thank you for the question. On the opposite, von Neumann, you're right. Von Neumann, he goes out of his way in order to praise what we obtain methodologically, heuristically speaking, out of McCulloch-Pitts networks. So when you can black box certain things that they are too difficult to study, you bracket them, you can gain a lot in terms of procedure, methodologies, studying the behavior ultimately of the object. And he praises that. He says that this insight of McCulloch is that whatever, when an entity can be precisely described, that entity can be mechanized, can be computed, the behavior of, obviously, that he says that that's a moment in history, right, to realize. For building computers, that's what I'm trying to say, right? So he praises them, he shows how useful that model is. Man, he writes the first draft, right? And that's the thing. In the back of his mind, he was like, yeah, but it's not for minds. And that's where the criticism starts, right? And eventually, by the way, McCulloch accepts. He, in a certain moment, confesses. He says, I've been teaching neuroscience all my life. I never had the need to talk about what happens inside. Now it seems that time is coming. He said that, right? In commenting what von Neumann was saying, because he said it in a letter. He wasn't able to attend that conference. So McCulloch himself, he read it. He called it the von Neumann's warning, right? All this criticism. And of course, McCulloch was the guy who commented first about this letter, right? And he said kind of a confession, right? He says that the time where we have to jump into structure is upon us, right? So yes, as a great model, to model something, and that something was a computer, he built that, but not for the mind. For any mind, for that matter, perhaps. Not any nervous system, perhaps. Let alone the human one, of course. Right? So yeah, that's a good clarification.
Great. I've got a question from Ben saying, is the need to model specifically the need to build in a physical sense, or could it also be in action, e.g. in theater, which is actually the domain where I practice my cybernetics? And I don't know if you're familiar with this example, and maybe Ben, if you want to say something about it, R.D. Laing's house in Kentish Town, for instance, he didn't literally build the house, but his actions made us. Ben, do you want to say a little more about what you mean by modeling through action?
Sure. So I guess I'm from a design background, an architect, so I'm used to making physical models of things, but also I'm aware as a teacher that often in the form in which I'm teaching, I'm modeling a process for someone else to do, for instance. So I also see what Tom does in his theatre work as a kind of modeling. So I guess I think that's an interesting clarification to the discussion for me. What really the need is, whether it's to need to kind of embody in a physical thing. And as a historical example, so R.D. Laing, who, you know, this features in Pickering's book, is kind of taking a kind of cybernetic approach to therapy in a very kind of socially enacted, worldly way, with this house in Kentish Town where the therapists are living with the patients in this very kind of enacted way. So for me, I can think of that as a kind of enacted model of doing something, a kind of sketch of what the world is like, and that's kind of how Pickering frames it, I think. So I'm wondering, can these things count as models? And does that make a difference if they do?
Alcibiades, do they count as models?
I will counter that question with a question for you guys. Is acting a physical model? Would you consider that a physical model?
Well, this is okay. This is great. So I think one of the things I've learned from reading your book, Alcibiades, and I'm still in the middle of processing it, so I haven't totally landed on it yet, was understanding the work that I'm doing, trying to use theater as a kind of cybernetic modeling tool, is to try and stay faithful. I don't know what the word is. Like I said, I'm still processing that. I haven't totally landed yet, but this idea of why I like to use actors, actors trained in a certain cybernetic approach to acting to model behavior, is because I can model the behavior and I don't have to pry open the brain of the actor. So in a sense, I think that I am trying to, in a way, with a second order cybernetic awareness, I hope, trying to get back to a place where there is a kind of enacted materiality of, you put people together under these sets of constraints, if they have these particular desires, and we see behaviors that we may be able to discover patterns in, but I don't have to break open the human nervous system. So this is where this idea of social phenomenon as well, like, is there something about the machine of the human can remain unpried open, but I can still, I think of when I direct a play or put a play together, I think of it like a homeostat ultimately. So,
So let me tell you one thing. You know this gun turret, this anti-aircraft weaponry that Wiener was working on with Bigelow and the gang. They needed 14 people, right, to operate. 14 people, okay? So the way I would see what you're telling me without getting into a social is seeing all this, the theater staff, all the actors as a machine, right? So in the case of the gun turret and the anti-aircraft weaponry, we have more elements or less elements, machine, human, human, and the aim was to treat them all equal. We need to, because the Germans are coming and the Japanese are coming their way. So we're coming, so we have to do it, okay? What you're telling me, I wouldn't see a problem in applying a classical cybernetics through and through straight up model, where you see all these people are cogs, right? You don't care about their minds, if they're going through a depression or whatever. My supervisor was asking me, do you want to write about cybernetics or you want to write all your sins? Which kind of put me straight up into what I had to do, because I was struggling, because cybernetics, when you get deep, it brings up like personal things, right? It challenges everything, right? So no, what mattered was the task at hand, which was writing my dissertation. And the same thing I can tell you, I mean, that would be a perfectly cybernetic approach without saying, oh, I'm applying cybernetics to a social. I wouldn't consider that social, no.
Interesting. Well, I did once get in trouble, a shocked expression from my graduate supervisor when I was in directing school, before I stumbled upon cybernetics, when I said, well, a play is like a machine, and this was to his humanistic, he was horrified that I would describe a play, a theater performance, as a machine.
Then we could bring Alan Turing to defend the machine, because Alan Turing had a particular beef with people having the machine put down, right? Why do we expect the machine to commit no mistakes? Whereas a human, when we commit mistakes, is intelligent, right? A mathematician, whatever, you scramble for possible solutions, but a machine cannot err not one. Oh, stupid thing. It must be a machine.
Unless it's designed to do stupid things.
Yeah, in order to make you believe it's intelligent.
Right, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that might be a poor understanding of what a machine is. But that, for example, that I think is changing. I think that people are beginning to be more respectful in seeing fellow humans as the spiritual machines of sorts.
Okay, great. All right, there's much more we could talk about in terms of that. I'm going to go to a question from Klaus Krippendorf, who says, I think cybernetics has ignored the role of language. And there's a rejoinder from Jude, which I'll get to in a moment. But you mentioned Heisenberg, who said that reality is the response to physicist questions. So where do the questions come from? Don't cyberneticians have questions other than building machines? And we know they certainly do in the second order. What's your response to that in the days of the classical cybernetics?
Well, there was only one philosopher, Northrop Frye, I believe. These guys were not people who asked questions, right? These guys were people who were giving a funding from the military, build this, and you have this amount of time, right? Now, the difficulty of the task made them ask questions, but it wasn't the other way around. So these guys were pretty focused, and the questions were fulfilling whatever was needed to fulfill the task, right? So something were not necessary to even think about, right? I would agree that the notion of language perhaps not was entirely addressed, but they were very aware, I would say. McCulloch and Pitts had formation in the classics. He knew Latin and Greek like this. He could read Latin and Greek like the newspaper. Not only he was a smart mathematician, but he was extremely cultivated. That kind of American he was. So I don't think that he was like not aware that you know, that language brings some bewitchments, and that, you know, basically what one could criticize to the computational theory of the mind nowadays, right? That is basically makes sense only in English because it's based upon basically every stuff that has been done in English, right? When you see it in other languages, you are like, even the translation doesn't look, it looks strange, okay? And many IT philosophers speak only one language anyways, which is English, you know? So whereas the cyberneticians, that was not the case. The guys were speaking several languages, you know, they were like very aware of the issue of language, I would say. But correct, as far as I remember, it doesn't come up in their musings. Maybe it didn't have to come up, right? So that's what I would say.
Thank you. We're running to the end of time, and there's a lot of great buzz in the chat, and lots of great discussions. And this has certainly provoked. Oh, Andre's got something to say about dams. Comment: Ashby's search for a general model of cognition didn't stop with the failure of dams. Between 53 and 58, he explored alternative ideas and came very close to formulating a fundamentally new model. What say you, Alcibiades, to?
Absolutely. It's just that I wasn't interested in that. That's what I said at the beginning. Right?
Okay.
So I didn't find it as revolutionary, as romantic,
Andre
as
raises
heroic.
Andre raises
Sorry?
an important point that he was not utterly defeated, whether or not you were interested in his ongoing.
Look, how you see the laboratory in Illinois, like Urbana campaign. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to, you know, like stuff for people.
Yeah, I think you should watch your step on
I should okay, I should
this moment.
But look, it was like a dark enterprise there. People didn't understand what was going on there. It became like a niche thing, you know. And that can be heroic, and that can be interesting for people. Yeah, sure. If it pans out in something, we're listening here. No problem, right? But in terms of philosophy, cybernetics was profoundly, I would say philosophers took notice. Right? When you see Richard Taylor criticizing Wiener, that was good criticism. This guy was a young philosopher, analytic at that. He was like relentless with Wiener. To a point that Wiener at a certain point doesn't want to answer. He said, oh, that's philosophical. Sure, well, you don't know what to answer, you will say that, right? So, yeah, this second part of cybernetics, which Dupuy also acknowledges, happens, you know, I don't know if out of Ashby, but he jumped into this, you know, out there realm, you know, the nowhere affects the node, the known, sorry. Yeah, it's just not classical cybernetics. It's something that, you know, at least for me, and for most people, I would say that are into cybernetics, they don't see that as cybernetics. I mean, that probably is a controversial thing to say, no? So I should have
Paul says, I do need to read Paul's comment. Calling BCL a niche thing, biological computer thing, is one thing. Saying no one knew what was going on is too dismissive.
People knew. Okay, let me backtrack. But it wasn't 1948 cybernetics. Not that. I think
we can agree it was not on the front page of Time magazine. Go ahead, Paul.
And it was not 1948 cybernetics. I'm sorry.
It wasn't 1948?
It was, I thought you just said that BCL was 1948 cybernetics.
No. I'm saying it's not as known as 1948.
Known as 1948.
Yeah, the book.
So to say no one knew what was going on is too dismissive, but I think we can agree that it was not on the cover of Time magazine, whether that's
didn't make it to the Soviet Union, didn't get that much military funding, didn't get attention from philosophers and from, you know, the intelligence at large, many other things. It wasn't like classical cybernetics, right?
These are your measures of greatness.
Not necessarily, just objective assessments.
I'm sorry, these are your measures of what you call objective greatness.
Absolutely. No, I wouldn't say greatness. I would say just what is around there.
Influence.
Not great. Influence. There
you're wiggling a little bit, but I allow that.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
All right.
That I didn't say successfully. I don't think so. No.
Okay. But for the record, you want to say you mean influential, not necessarily great.
Yes.
Yes.
Influential is better than successful.
Yeah, not at all. I mean, we don't know if we're going to succeed. Maybe we're going to change the world. Maybe, I don't know. Right? But that it was less known, I agree with that. I think that we can agree with that. Right?
Okay. Well, the second order cybernetics has certainly changed my world. And so that's something
Fair
I'll
enough. Fair enough.
This has been, I knew this was going to be a provocative session, and that's sometimes how I see my role in the ASC, as bringing in guests that maybe we wouldn't come across in our normal way of things, and knowing that this is a very rich community that will engage in this kind of a generative discussion, and I hope it was generative for all of you, and generative for you, Alcibiades, as well. And it certainly
Absolutely.
has
Thank
been
you.
for me. And we're at time. So thank you all for joining us. Paul, do you want to say
Thank you,
anything
guys.
as president?
Paul.
No, just to thank you, Alcibiades, for your wonderful scholarship, far beyond mine in those domains, and also to Tom for a wonderful job. Thank you so much, both.